So we're now basically, we're out of, like pre-revolutionary America, and we're gonna start in on, revolutionary America. So how we went from, essentially British colonies to, to actually the United States. First thing that you need to understand is, and I know it was touched on some in the first unit, um, but hopefully you're aware, hopefully you've realized by now, or maybe this is just common knowledge, I don't know, that obviously Britain is not the only one in the quote unquote New World, right? Like they're not the only one in North and South America. There are a wide variety of European countries that are all trying to exert their own dominance in the New World. Portugal, for instance, controls Brazil. Spain controls much of like Central America. England's got the coast of the United States today, and then the Hudson Bay Company. And if you don't know where the Hudson Bay is, it's like right there on that big old map in the back. But it's a massive, massive bay up in Canada. And then basically between the Hudson Bay and the coastal United States, right, like the what we think is the east coast of the U.S. today, there's the St. Lawrence River, and that's controlled by the French, and sort of in the Great Lakes region is sort of controlled by the French. The French have the Mississippi, and everything west of the Mississippi. And so there's a substantial amount of conflict between those European nations as they all basically try to like pillage and plunder and exploit the New World for their own wealth. And so what that leads to is a significant amount of conflict. And the French are the ones that will actually end up with the most conflict for a couple of reasons. One, the French and the English, and I'm not a world history guy, but the French and the English fight each other all the time. But I don't know why. Like I've never figured out why. They just don't like each other, and they're constantly at war. I mean, there's the 100 Years' War and the 7 Years' War, and like I don't. They just there's so many English-French wars that it's sort of ridiculous. And France is also geographically most. It's the closest to the British colonies, right? Obviously, Brazil and Portugal has no bearing on us. Even Spanish Mexico doesn't really have any bearing on us, as we're sort of the 13 colonies. But the French do, because the French essentially have us like surrounded, right? Because they control the St. Lawrence River, which is to our north, and they control the Mississippi, which is to our west, all right? The French also, because they're more frontier, I mean they're deeper into the heart of the new continent. They're going to get into some significant skirmishes with the Indians as well. They're not the only. I mean, obviously, most of the European nations get into various battles with Native American tribes because the natives are here and white people don't really recognize that. So this map right here basically shows you what I was just talking about, right? So this right here is the St. Lawrence River, right? It runs from this bay down into the Great Lakes, right? And then you've got the Mississippi that runs down this way. And so this is Louisiana, and this is like what we would refer to today as French Canada, right? The significant aspects, the St. Lawrence River is a navigable river, right? So it's a deep river, kind of like the Mississippi. You can actually like sail it, right? Which is obviously like, you can't sail a Brazos, you know that, right? You can't put a ship. It's not a big enough river to put a ship on. If you've ever driven across the Mississippi, like that is a massive, massive river. St. Lawrence is sort of similar, okay? So the fact that the French control both of these massive waterways that take you into the interior of the U.S. provides them with a significant sort of foothold. Additionally, in what will become the United States,
the French established the port of New Orleans, and New Orleans becomes a very, very significant sort of hub for trade. Ports are the most important cities of the time, because obviously we don't have air travel. Ships are how you ship everything. There's no automobiles, no planes, none of that stuff. Okay, so ports are ways of sort of exposing yourself to other cultures, other products, commercialism, all that wonderful stuff. The British colonial system is a commercial system, and so the actual term for it is mercantilism. Like that's a vocab term that you need to know. You need to understand what mercantilism is, and you need to really understand sort of how British mercantilism itself functioned. So British mercantilism, well here, let's go to the definition first, right? So the definition of mercantilism is essentially like commercialism, okay? It's not the same thing as capitalism. Do not confuse mercantilism and capitalism, because mercantilism is created unfairly, right? Like there's no, in a true capitalistic sense, there should be like free markets and fair trade and opportunities for everybody. In a mercantilist sense, that's not the case. Okay, whatever entity is controlling mercantilism, in this case the British government, they are doing things that benefit them. Everyone else be damned. Okay, they do not care about the welfare or well-being or economic progress of anybody but the British. All right, but it is still commercial, because mercantilism is all about like buying and selling and trading goods. Okay. It's just manipulating markets in order to get yourself the best deal. And one of the ways that they do this is through the Navigation Acts, where the British are essentially trying to, price out competition, and sometimes just through market manipulation, like they make it illegal to trade with the Dutch or other European nations, right? And again, not a British history class, but like if you understand Britain at this point, this is the period of English history in which that term is coined. The sun never sets on the British Empire, because it's so massive that no matter what time of the day it is, like somewhere on the planet, the sun is shining on British-controlled territory. Right, whether that's Australia or India or England or the colonies or like Hong Kong, Taiwan. They eventually acquire like Iran and Iraq. I don't know when, but the British like control all sorts of things. This is just an image of Boston, so obviously this isn't a picture painting, but it hopefully it sort of shows you, or it gives you an idea sort of the importance of ports and shipping. Boston becomes, because it has a naturally sort of conducive port, meaning that it's sort of deep water relatively quickly, so you can get ships relatively close to the coast. Boston becomes a prominent sort of commercial center for the United States. The Dominion of New England the Dominion is basically a declaration that says that the English government, the British government, the Crown, controls the colonies and is able to exert his will on the colonies. And this is like the 1680s, maybe. I mean, so we're still talking about colonial times, but it's some of the stuff that leads us up to the Revolution, right? Because right after the Dominion of New England, you have the Glorious Revolution in England, right? And I think that's in one of the last units. But the Glorious Revolution is the idea, or the British people overthrow the crown, right? And Oliver Cromwell becomes like the I forget the term that they give him, but he's not the king, but he runs England. right about the same time, you have a guy named John Locke, who's an English philosopher and probably one of the most prominent, important philosophers sort of in the history of the world. He writes a couple of books at the time, but ultimately he comes up with sort of philosophical understandings, philosophical ideas of government, how government should operate. Right? Locke essentially believes that government only has a responsibility to protect three things: life, liberty, and property. Right? So anything else is an overreach on government's part, according to Locke. Locke believes that government doesn't really provide rights, that rights just exist. Right? Like, you were born, you have a right to life. Government doesn't give it to you. Like, government can't just be like, we're gonna murder you to death. Right? Because you were born, and Locke uses the term natural rights endowed by the Creator, right? So whatever God you believe in, like, that God somehow created you, birthed you, whatever, right? That God gave you life. It is not up to any government to take that life from you. Okay? Liberty is a synonym for freedom, right? So again, you were born free. Government can't take that freedom from you. Now, obviously, we want to realize real quick that gets a little dicey in America, because we have a substantial subset of the population that's not free. And then property, right? So the things that you own. Government has a responsibility to ensure that I just don't walk up to Berger right now and steal his laptop, right? Because I'm bigger and stronger than him, and I can just push him down and take it. Okay? I am bigger than you.
How are you? Stronger then?
Yes. If you bench press your body weight, and I bench press half my body weight, I still bench press more than you.
How's your body weight?
I don't know, Joe. 180. No, that can't be half my body weight. That makes me 360. I'm not that heavy. Let's say 130.
60?
How much you weigh?
155.
Okay, so I'm close. Still. All right. So the Dominion of New England doesn't last for very long. One, because of that glorious revolution, and so like the king is removed in England, and so the colonies they actually have a long tradition of self-rule, which is actually going to be wildly problematic for the English, right? The easiest way that I can explain this to you is essentially the colonies are like a child, right? Like they're England's baby. Okay. Now, obviously, none of you have children. I'm assuming none of you have children. Okay. But here's what I can tell you. I'm making assumptions. I don't know. I'm assuming none of you have kids. If you do have kids, here's what I'm gonna tell you. Right? You cannot like leave your child alone when they are young and let them do whatever they want, and then when they become a teenager, be like, now is the time for rules, because that teenager's not gonna have it. They have been autonomous, self-governing for so long that you cannot begin to implement rules at that point. In fact, the reality is you can only go the other way, right? Like, you almost, like, I mean, think about it. Like, think about your own childhood, right? Like, when you were a kid, anybody in here have a bedtime? Like, mommy makes you go to bed at a certain time? Okay. Most of you probably did when you were a child, though, right? Like, okay? Most of you probably had restrictions on, like, how much television you could watch, or when you had to eat, or what you had to eat, right? Like, as you get older, you get more freedom and more autonomy, and you can do things sort of on your own, okay? That's how it works. If you try to go the other way, like, trust me, if you let a 3-year-old eat whatever they want, okay, because all they will eat is sugar, and then when they turn 5, they're like, hey, you have to eat some broccoli. They're not having it. Like, they're not going to do it. Okay? And so what happens is in America, the colonies get to dictate for themselves what they do sort of all the time. They have their own governments. They have their own systems of government. They have their own assemblies. They have their own governors. They don't really abide by English rule. In fact, this concept of salutary neglect basically means the England has a whole bunch of rules on the colonies and nobody follows them. And England doesn't even try to enforce them. Okay? Because unenforced rules are no rules at all, and they're pointless. They're absolutely worthless. right? Like if I told all of you that you had to stand during class so as to not fall asleep, right? And I never made anybody stand up. That's not a real rule, right? Because nobody's trying to enforce it, and which then again reinforces your ability to sit or stand or do whatever you want while I'm teaching. Okay, so what we have is we have like governors and assemblies are basically another word for like a Congress, right, or a city council or whatever, that are ultimately passing rules and regulations, and there's a long history in the colonies of self-government. And so when England, because England will, like spoiler alert, England will begin to try to enforce more regulations on the colonies. That's going to be one of the significant reasons as to why the colonies begin to rebel, right? Warfare in the colonies. There's a lot of warfare, again, in part because we have those competing neighbors, right? We have the French that we're dealing with. The Spanish control Florida, which is relatively close to us, so like that actually matters. We also have all sorts of conflicts with the Indians. Okay, so King William's War is one of the earliest examples, and I forget exactly who they were fighting with. Some Native American group. But the French and Indian War is the one that ultimately sets off a great deal of conflict and struggle, right? So the French and Indian War, first of all, the French and the Indian are together. It's not the French fighting the Indians, okay? It's the British fighting the French and the Indians, okay? It's over territorial concerns, because that's what all the wars were over, right? Is over land, and on some level, the French and Indian War sort of becomes it almost becomes like a world war. So in addition to like fighting here in the colonies, there's also fighting in like Europe between the French and the English. Spain gets involved, like it becomes a pretty big ordeal. Ultimately, in the French and Indian War, the English are victorious, right? So ultimately, the English win. This is just some of the major battles, because, like I said, it was a fairly significant war. And again, you'll notice you don't really have coastal battles over here for the most part, due in large part to the fact that it's actually about the Ohio River Valley, which is right in here, and who controls that. But it's looking at sort of further access into the New World. So by the time we get to like the mid 18th century here, the British colonies along the coast are actually becoming sort of heavily populated, and they're getting a little crowded. And you have some significant increases in immigration, and so people are moving further and further west. And so as the people move further west, they're running into native groups, and then they're also running into these French forts and French trading posts throughout the sort of the Mississippi River Valley region of the United States, right? With this, you end up with some rising tensions. The colonies are beginning to sort of realize that they have sort of a common agenda or a common cause. So this Albany Plan of Union is essentially trying to begin the process of 13 independent colonies, which is what they were, right? They are independent up until this point. Okay, so Massachusetts owes nothing to Maryland. Virginia has no allegiances to Delaware, but they begin to realize that divided, it's very easy to like kill them, right? But if they were to be joined, they would actually have an opportunity to sort of fight for their common good. Braddock was if I remember correctly, Braddock's defeat was at the hands of Braddock is a British officer who attacked the French and lost, costing the colonies a fair amount, which is one of the reasons why they realized they need to sort of join together. The 7 Years' War, that's one of those French and English wars. Again, spills over into the U.S. or into the colonies. Again, sort of World War concept, because everybody is essentially getting involved. The key concept of this is the Prime Minister of England at the time is a guy named William Pitt. Pitt basically realizes, and if you're not aware of this, like war is expensive, right? It's really expensive because you have to pay soldiers and you have to buy bullets and guns and cannonballs and like move troops places, and so you have to pay for ships to do that. Like war is really, really expensive, and the English are essentially hemorrhaging money. They're accumulating some significant and massive debts as a result of sort of constant conflict. And so one of the things that Pitt wants to do is Pitt wants to basically pass that cost on to the colonists, right? And so now the colonists are going to bear a significant amount of that cost, right? By 1763, this conflict is over, right? And the English are victorious, and so to the victor go the spoils. And so the area between, y'all know where the Appalachian Mountains are? Berger does. Anybody else? So we'll use this map right here because it's a little bit easier since it's big. So the Appalachian Mountains are basically a mountain range that runs from western New York south down to like northern Georgia. All right, so it's like right through there, basically like western North Carolina, western Virginia, West Virginia, right through this region here. That had been basically the western extension of the English colonies, right? And so just over the Appalachian Mountains, this is the Ohio River Valley, and I told you a second ago that's what we're fighting over in this French and Indian War, right? Okay, so to the victor go the spoils. The English now control the Ohio River Valley, except that the English think, right, and there it is here. The English think that they're going to get all of Louisiana, right? That's what they believe. However, they don't, right? So if you notice, you've got the red line now on the map. That is that's the proclamation line of 1763. So as a part of this peace treaty, the English get this territory, but they basically tell the colonists, like, hey, you can't cross the Appalachian Mountains because we're not going to let you. We're just going to make an imaginary line and say don't go past this, even though this is now our territory, because they don't want to continue getting into skirmishes with the native groups here. So they basically make this like a native reserve, right? Like an Indian reserve. Louisiana, basically, during the Treaty of 1763, the French get together with the Spanish because they had sided together, and the French basically have a little backroom deal with the Spanish, and so they give Louisiana to Spain sort of underhandedly so that the English can't get the territory west of the Mississippi. Now, because y'all went through 8th grade history, right? We eventually buy Louisiana, yes? Who we buy it from? We buy it from the French. They won't get it back, right? So, British North America basically doubles, although there's some significant conflict as a result of this. So again, England's trying to manage these new territories. They don't want colonists going west of the proclamation line because they don't want to have to defend the colonists, meaning they don't want like here's the problem, right? They own the land because some native groups didn't really have concepts of land ownership. And even the ones that did have the concept of land ownership, like white people just didn't care. They just went in and took it anyway, because, why not? But because the natives were still there, you would end up with some significant, like, conflicts. And then when, like, a colonist and a native tribe are in a war, well, now, like, the British army has to go out there and, like, help. And the British army is tired of that, because they're tired of fighting what they see as, like, colonist conflict. Like, it's basically, again, imagine that, if you will, like, the colonist is a child, right? Now we got a petulant little teenager, okay? And that teenager goes and picks a fight with somebody, and they get hit in the face, and then they run to you, the parent, and they're like, I need you to beat this person up for me. And you're like, right? Because now you have to protect your child, right? Because if you don't protect your child, that just speaks ill of you, and then it opens up, like, all of your other children to getting beaten up as well. You understand that concept? Right? Because it's not just the colonies now that England's got. Like, they've got the West Indies, they've got India, they got Australia, they got some small territories in Asia, like South Africa, they've got a lot, right? So even if the colonists pick the fight and then the colonists get punched in the face, now England's like, I gotta go to war again because you can't keep your mouth shut, right? Or in this case, you can't stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. You keep venturing out there, right? So they're not wild about that. Pontiac's Rebellion is another native conflict that we get into because, and again, this just shows you how, like, little concern white people had for non-white folk in the 18th century, right? But we have the French and Indian War. The British defeated both the French and the Indians. Yet there's no negotiations with the Indians. Like, we only negotiate with the French, and then we take, like, a whole bunch of land from the French. And the natives are like, bro, that wasn't even their land to begin with. Like, we live here. It's our land. The French don't have the right to cede that land to the British. So they end up in more fighting, okay? Which is where this proclamation line comes from. And then I already told you, like, as immigration was going up, they're just going to disregard the proclamation line. Because again, as I said earlier, the English make a whole bunch of rules, and the colonists are like, I don't really care. I'm gonna do what I want to do, right? So after the French and Indian War, right, like after we get to this point in 1763, now the British are grossly in debt. They need to start trying to create, like, or revenue or income. The way governments make money is through taxes. Like, that's it. That's all. That's the only way government can make money, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start taxing the colonies pretty heavily. Whether it's the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, all of these are just various legislative initiatives by the British in order to tax the colonists, to get the colonists to pay for what the British feel like is their fair share of the war, right? Because again, we talked about this, I mean, the French and Indian War here in the colonies, right? But it also spills over everywhere else. So the British are extended fighting everywhere. The colonists look at it like, no, bro, like that's your war elsewhere. The British are like, well, but we fought here too. Y'all got to pay your share. Okay, so both sides on some level have, like, a legitimate argument. Okay, but what comes out of all of this is, and the reality is, if you ever want to look at, like, why revolutions happen, right? For the most part, revolution happens for economic reasons, right? Like, if you really want to understand history and government and like why government does things and why people react to government behaviors in certain ways, just follow the money. Everything is about money. Money. Like, seriously, on a multiple choice history test, if you ever get a question that was like, why did this happen? And money is one of the answers, it's probably the right answer. Okay? So the colonists now all of a sudden are feel like they're being overtaxed, right? In addition to being overtaxed, they have no say in said taxation, right? Which is taxation without representation. And it leads to this Whig point of view. The Whigs will be a future political party when we get closer to the revolution. When we get closer to the Civil War. But basically, it's the foundation of sort of the ideologies of revolution, right? Like, these are the first people basically rising up and being like, nah, bro, we gotta fight. Right? The Sons of Liberty is Sam Adams' group that's going to begin engaging in protests. And no matter what white folks tell you, not peaceful protests. Right? Protests are rarely peaceful because peaceful protests rarely accomplish anything. Right? The non-importation movement is basically the idea, look, the British are taxing all of this crap that keeps coming in. Like, every time we buy it, we have to pay a tax on it. So we're just gonna stop buying stuff. We're gonna stop bringing stuff into the colonies, and we're gonna try to rely on the colonies for everything here. And if the colonies start working together, that's actually somewhat feasible, right? Because there's no cotton, right? There's nothing being grown in Massachusetts that you can make clothing out of, right? And importation agreements mean like, well, we got to take it from the English. But if you go to the southern colonies and you get it from them, like, now all of a sudden you're sort of operating within your own country, and you don't have to import stuff, which is part of the reason why they work together. The Daughters of Liberty are basically the ones that are trying to stop some of that importation stuff, because, believe it or not, women are able to exercise some influence, especially when it comes to like household stuff, right? Because women, like, they're the head of the house, like, they run the household. Like, the man goes and does his thing, right? But like, it's the woman's kitchen, and the woman does the shopping, and the woman does the cooking, and so like the woman does the clothes making. And so if the woman is like, well, I ain't buying nothing that's imported, which is what the Daughters of Liberty stopped doing. Like, they were like, we're not gonna buy English sugar. Like, we'll do without, right? Like, we'll figure out a way. Like, that's what ends up happening, right? So the colonies become sort of unified, and basically decide that they're going to stop abiding by these rules, right? Which leads to the repeal of the Stamp Act. But then, and this is one of those things where, again, if you're talking about it in terms of like raising a child, right? Your child throws a little temper tantrum, which is what the colonials did, right? Like the colonies threw a temper tantrum. And then England went, okay, we'll get rid of the Stamp Act, right? But then they passed the Declaratory Act, which basically says, but we have the right to like make laws for you. Well, you've now essentially proven that you don't, because you have now essentially proven like, well, if you fight me, I'm going to back down and I'm going to give you what you want, but I can still like make rules for you. No. So once that happens, right, and then we have the Townsend Acts, or new regulations, and Pitt, again, that's the same guy I mentioned earlier. He's trying to basically use the colonies as a source of revenue for the British government. It's not going well, and it's not going to go well, right? And so Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, basically, Adams and Otis create this sometimes referred to as the Massachusetts Circular Letter, that is it stops just short of a call for war. But the Sons of Liberty are a very sort of what's the word I'm looking for? They're I'm gonna say violent. Like, I mean, they get violent, but violent's not the word I'm looking for. They're aggressive though. Right, and they essentially stop just short of calling for like armed revolts and revolution, but through this letter and with Sam Adams, this is where the Boston Tea Party comes from, right? Then ultimately after that, we get the Boston Massacre, and if you know, anybody know how many people died in the Boston Massacre? 5. Sound like a massacre to you? Right, like, that's not a massacre at all, right? But I need you to understand that propaganda can play a significant role in this. In fact, you end up with like pictures like this that just look like the British just walking in and firing into a crowd of peaceful protesters, right? The reality is that the peaceful protesters like started throwing rocks at the British first. They were antagonizing them. They were trying to get the British to engage. The first casualty of this war is a guy named Crispus Attucks, who's a free black man, right? The first casualty in the American Revolution is actually a black man, okay? But this is the first bloodshed that we have between the colonists and the English. And it's going to lead to the revolution, essentially, right? So it's that first step because it is that first bloodshed. Eventually the Gaspee is a ship that ran aground, and the colonists row out to it and set it aflame. They burned the ship. Because this ship was one of the British ships that was actually responsible for trying to stop smugglers. Because obviously if there's importation taxes, but the colonies still need to get things, how do you get around the import tax? You smuggle stuff in, right? John, y'all know who John Hancock is? John Hancock is a master smuggler at the time. Like, Hancock is probably the first millionaire in the history of the United States. And he makes his millions of dollars smuggling in goods to the colonies in violation of British, like, taxing acts. Okay? We eventually get the Boston Tea Party out of all of this. The committees of correspondence, the Sons of Liberty, again, are a part of this. They're trying to create dialogue between the colonies. Because again, at this point, if it is Boston and Massachusetts only that revolts against the crown, they will lose. But if they can get everybody on board, that join or die, right, they can do it. This is just another piece of propaganda. Right, the little Tea Act, right, so they're forcing tea down the throat of the colonies. I don't know, a lot of colonies are naked, probably because they're being pillaged and raped and you know, having everything taken from them so that these people can, like, the British can profit off of it and make money. The response to the Tea Party, because obviously you when your children go and dump a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor, you can't let that go unpunished, right? So one, they close Boston Harbor. They pass the Intolerable Acts. They try to take away all legislatures, basically say that you can't have any sort of self-government. One of the big ones is that now, if you are tried with, or if you're accused of some crime, you have to go all the way back to England now to stand trial, right? And so some of these things that are happening right here, right now, you'll actually see that when we create our new country, these are some of the key components that end up showing up in the Bill of Rights, right? The new Quartering Act says that British troops can basically just show up at your house, knock on the door, and be like, hey, I'm gonna take your bedroom. You gotta go sleep on the couch, right? By the way, I want my breakfast at 6 a.m. I take 2 eggs, some toast, like, and the colonists, there was no recourse for that. They had to abide by it, right? Because if they didn't do what the soldiers wanted, the soldiers would essentially just take their house and throw them out. Right? That's why our Third Amendment to the Constitution says that you can't ever, the government can never force you to quarter troops, ever. Okay? Right? We do end up with the First Continental Congress out of all of this, because we are now sort of revolutionized. We're now coming together, right? Patrick Henry is one of the early sort of influencers, and his quote, I mean, his quote is still famous today. It's, give me liberty or give me death, right? So if the British are going to treat us this way, I would rather die fighting for freedom than continue to live. And they would actually probably have used the term as a slave, ironically. Like, they would have seen that as sort of slavery, right? This all leads to Lexington and Concord, okay, which are like the first, we consider these the first battles of the Revolutionary War, right? Meaning the first actual battles. And so your map here basically just shows you where the British come through, how the Americans attack them. And the Americans, one, you need to understand that in this conflict, America is going to utilize strategies that are unbecoming, right? So up to this point, basically, when you fight, I never understood this. Like, I was in the Marine Corps, and I just, like, this idea is so foreign to me, right? But wars in the 18th century, you have like a whole bunch of people line up in an open field, and then the other army would line up on the other side, an open field. and then you have an officer, and he'd be like, aim, and everybody would like drop their rifle and they would aim. Not that they really aimed, because musket balls you couldn't aim, and they were not very accurate. And then they would be like, fire, and literally you would like, okay, because the other side would fire as you're trying to like reload your musket. Because if you know anything about reloading a musket, you basically like you pour gunpowder down the barrel of then you put the little ball in, and then you have to jam the ball down there, right? And then you pull that rod out, okay? And then you can go fire again. But I'm talking like if you're good, you might be able to get off 2 shots a minute, right? Now, imagine standing in an open field and being like, I'm only gonna be able to fire 2 shots a minute, and there's a whole army across the way, and they're gonna be firing at me, and I'm just standing here like out in the open, like, hey, shoot me. Dumbest way to fight a war, like, the Americans don't do that crap, okay? They basically hide behind trees, like they have snipers up in trees. They, not only do they like not line up and shoot at like the privates on the other army, they actually take aim at officers, which is like unbecoming at the time. Like you don't attack, because officers are gentlemen, right? But like privates in the army, they're unwashed miscreants and they can die and nobody cares. But the officers have like authority and titles and land, like they're people that matter, right? And the Americans are like, dude, if you don't have an officer to tell you what to do, your army's just going to fall apart, so let's shoot the officers first, which is genius, and one of the things that actually helps. Right, so Lexington and Concord actually begin the revolution. Y'all know Paul Revere's little story of riding and rounding up the militia, so that y'all know that story? Somewhat. All right, go watch. What is it? What's that Nicolas Cage movie? No, National Treasure. Isn't that it? Like 1 if I land, 2 if I see. No, they hang a little like lantern in some church in Boston. Revere sees it, rides off, rounds up a whole bunch of people in the middle of the night so that they can go and fight. The conflict spreads. Washington ultimately becomes the commander of the Continental Army. And then we get the Battle of Bunker Hill. So the British actually attack Bunker Hill. The British win, but it's so costly that you almost can't count it as a win, right? The British lose so much trying to take Bunker Hill, which is up in Massachusetts, that it's almost a loss. And very early on, the colonists are trying to negotiate for peace. The King of England, King George, is not having it. He calls them open and avowed enemies, meaning like, we're going to go in there and annihilate you. And it never dawned on the British that they could possibly lose this war, because the British are the greatest military in the world at the time. They are the strongest, largest, most powerful country in the world. It never dawned on them that a bunch of militiamen could beat them in open conflict, right? But ultimately what ends up happening is in places like Fort Ticonderoga, colonial troops amass like surprise attacks and engage in behaviors that again are like ungentlemanly or whatever, that help them become more victorious, right? And Fort Ticonderoga is one of those examples, more toward the interior. Ticonderoga was actually originally a French fort that the British got as a result of the French and Indian Wars, right? Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet or a book called Common Sense, which becomes essentially a battle cry for the new nation, right? And it's a very philosophical, ideological sort of pamphlet talking about how things should be and how people should be treated and how governments should behave and whatnot. And so ultimately through this, right, like even the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge, which, I don't know which battle is that? That's a colonial victory, if I remember correctly, that helps. I think that one's in North Carolina, if I remember correctly. That helps increase what's the word, morale, right? Because that matters. It's really significant, right? if the British just keep coming in and beating the colonists down in every conflict, right, then you're like, oh, we can't win because there's this like massive army. But the fact that there are victories like Morse Creek, it helps increase morale, and it helps basically the colonists decide, like, we don't want to be like subjects anymore. Like, we don't want to be a part of the British Empire. We don't want to behave this way. We don't want to be taken advantage of like this. And so it helps further those feelings, because you need to understand that when the revolution first started, it's a relatively small group of Americans that are actually revolutionary. In fact, when sort of the revolution, the first ideas of the revolution begin, the Tories, who are the British nationalists, right, the people that side with the British, they're actually larger in number than the Whigs, than the Sons of Liberty type people who want revolution, right? And so ultimately we get another Continental Congress that is going to draft the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure you know was signed July 4th, 1776. Okay, and it's essentially it's a couple of things. Really, it's it's a list of grievances and a declaration of war at the same time. If you've never actually read the Declaration, I would advise you to actually read it. It's good to understand exactly what is in it, because the truth of the matter is, the Declaration of Independence actually tells you that revolution is not only sort of necessary, like not only something that you could do, but it essentially argues that it's something that you're obligated to do. That when government is no longer responsive to the needs of the people, revolution is the response. And personally, I'm a little surprised that you don't see more rhetoric about the Declaration of Independence today, considering our government sucks. But you'll learn more about that in government next year. Except you already know. You already heard me rail about how bad government is last year. Yeah. A couple of points that, they have to be addressed. Otherwise, they become elephants in the room. But the Declaration of Independence does create the idea, or does spell out, right? Like, it's actually in the document, all men are created equal, which is a fundamental principle. Yet it's not something that we abide by, obviously, because we've had slavery in the colonies at this point for roughly 150 years, and we'll have slavery in the colonies for another nearly 100 years after this point. But it is something that you should understand. People are already giving thought to it, right? There's already thought to sort of slavery and whether or not slavery is morally justified, or whether or not slavery can actually occur in a truly free nation. Vermont becomes the first state or colony to outlaw slavery, and they outlaw slavery in like 1780, I think. All right, that's it. So we're done. Does that beat having to watch it for y'all? Yeah? Awesome. So we're going to start doing that, and I recorded it right there for the kids at home.
All right. Have a good day, guys.